How are you defining libertarian in the book?
Well, I define libertarian as the current manifestation of what was once called liberalism or classical liberalism. It wasn't called classical at the time, now we call it classical. Liberal ideas are about freedom, individualism, individual rights, limited government to protect those things, free markets, freedom of religion, and so on. And in some sense, therefore, when you put them in big terms like that, they're the ideas of the American Revolution, the ideas of Western civilization. Your colleague at Reason, Brian Doherty, wrote a wonderful history of the libertarian movement. One of the things he said in there was, libertarian ideas are radical, but the modern Western world runs on approximately libertarian principles. So in that sense, they are fundamental to our world, but we insist that governments in the West and the rest of the world actually live up to these principles.
You know, of course, the libertarian movement in America is highly associated with somebody like Ayn Rand, who, you know, focused on rationality and reason as the thing that makes us different than beasts. Do libertarians put a premium on rational discourse, and if so, are they just kidding themselves?
I do think libertarians put a premium on rational discourse, but it's possible that that's because it's not easy to become a libertarian. The intellectual world, the newspapers, the academy, Hollywood, pretty much modern liberal, not classical liberal, modern liberal. And then there's a conservative counter-establishment, the Reaganites and Fox News and the Wall Street Journal editorial page. So it's reasonably easy, if you're a conservative, to find validators for your ideas.
And if say there's 4 people on a panel, you know, at Fox or even at Meet the Press, one is reserved for the token conservative.
Yes.
But the libertarian is not quite.
Well, that's generally right.
Yeah.
So that's right. If you're going to get to libertarian ideas, it's generally not by seeing people in the media and say, oh yeah, that's what I think.
Or let's face it, seeing successful people anywhere in America.
No, actually there are plenty of successful people who are libertarians, though they aren't necessarily identified that way. But it does mean that to become a libertarian, you're more likely to have arrived at those ideas by reading books, or at least talking to people who read books, or something like that. Now, we've done surveys at Cato, David Kirby and I, in which we find that anywhere from 15, 20, up to 40% of Americans hold broadly libertarian views, meaning sort of socially tolerant and fiscally conservative. But most of those people don't know they're libertarians. They're not libertarians in the sense of the ideas outlined in this book, but they're not really liberals or conservatives either. They don't really belong at either Fox News or NPR. So one of my goals with this book is to reach those 40 million people and say, you know, if you think the government spends too much and it should stay out of your personal life, you just might be a libertarian. I think what's happening is that freedom works, and eventually people figure that out. Political scientists have noted that as countries get richer, if they start to economically develop, there comes to be a point, and they try to find a place, it's $2,000 a year or $6,000 a year, that they start demanding political freedom as well, and that they start expecting personal freedom. Once you start making decisions in the marketplace, you expect to make other decisions. So that's part of it. And around the world, I think absolutely people are finally discovering they tried planning in half the world and it was a disaster. And it turns out countries that are engaged in the global economy, that allow people to experiment, start companies and so on, those companies get richer, and there is a growing tendency to respect freedom of religion, freedom of personal choices, the rule of law. I think people are noticing that countries with the rule of law are more successful. And this process has been going on a long time. You know, it was the Netherlands originally. They had freedom of religion and markets. And people started noticing, oh, that seems like a very pleasant place to live. It's getting richer, richer than the entire world at that time. Englishmen noticed that. Then people noticed that it was also working in England, and it spread out from there. And so it's taken, 300 years to get to Asia and Africa, but it is starting to get there. And even in Africa, you're starting to see some countries adopt greater levels of rule of law and markets and starting to get richer. And of course, in Asia, China and India have moved a long way in those directions, and that's what accounts for, I can absolutely say, the world is freer than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but you can kind of win that argument just on the basis of China and India.
Do you think there is a spike in interest in libertarian ideas and ways of seeing the world among younger people? And what are the issues that seem to resonate most from a libertarian perspective with millennials?
Well, there's probably two things going on there. Yes, absolutely, there's an increase in interest in libertarian ideas. Journalists often ask me, is there a surge of libertarian thinking these days? And one of the things I tell them is, 7 years ago, there was no National Libertarian Student Organization. Now there are two. Now, if they were two tiny groups of 4 people on the internet or something, that wouldn't mean very much. But in fact, both Students for Liberty and Young Americans for Liberty are very vibrant organizations. I was in a conservative student youth group many years ago, and I know what we actually had, and I know what they have, and they're pretty strong. Students for Liberty may indeed have gotten 1,500 students to Washington on this bitterly cold weekend we just concluded. Young Americans for Liberty has a mailing list, an email list of over 100,000. Together they have something like 1,500 chapters at college campuses. Students for Liberty has now developed groups in Latin America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. They had a conference with over 1,000 students in Africa on libertarian ideas. So a whole lot of people who are interested in libertarian ideas. Now, the more difficult question is, how much libertarian thinking generally is there among young people? And there, I think you can say, on issues like marijuana and marriage and transgender and other sexual issues, overwhelmingly libertarian. I talked to one of your young reporters just this weekend who was telling me about libertarianism on campus, and he said, well, look, you have to realize there is no right on the American campus today. There just are no conservatives. So there's a tiny number of leftists. There's a large mass of people who generally accept a lot of the liberal government should take care of people ideas, and there's a growing libertarian sentiment. But millennials are growing up in a world of infinite lifestyle choices, technological choices, market choices that has to be shaping the way they see the world. And I don't know exactly how that's going to play out. I think if you poll them, you still get, oh yeah, government should take care of people's health care. And yet they can see that these programs don't work very well. And in the long run, that has to affect the way they're thinking.